But it's great to be here, and it's very good to be part of this conference in Engle Farm. And for a long time, I've heard about this place and what goes on. So it's good to be. And I realise you come from a variety of things, and I am going to be picking up where Carl left off, and it is going to be around that faith because that's what you're exploring today. Can we just? Is it possible to just play some of this video? We're having a few challenges with the technology, so we'll just see what happens.
Tonight I am feeling for you under the state of a strange land. You would sacrifice much to be here. Therefore, the graces I offer my hand. Welcome home. I bid you welcome. I bid you welcome. She sings with the mountains memory high and high. There's a cloud that full length of these isles, just playing chase with the sun. And it's black and it's white and it's wild, all the colors are one. So to you now. Welcome home from the bottom of our heart. From the bottom of our heart.
Dave Dobbin was inspired to write that music. Dave Dobbin's one of the New Zealand personalities that Australia hasn't taken over. I know you're very good at taking over our best actors and musicians, but he wrote this after some anti-racism protests in Christchurch, and they were very nasty, but the community came out in response against them. And he was so inspired by that, he wrote that song. And it just typifies, I think, a sort of New Zealand and Australian community, and what's now part of what's now happening. My link to this subject today, and I don't come as an expert in refugee and migrant issues, but a number of years ago, the Salvation Army in New Zealand looked at what it was doing, and it was heavily involved in a whole range of services, such as is happening in Australia. And we looked at those services and we thought, well, let's go back over the last 10 years and see how effective we've been. And we went back, we're spending, I think, about $130 million a year on services nationally, and we went back over the 10 years and we tried to analyse what had been an impact on New Zealand of spending $120, $130 million a year. And we did it in 10 areas which we were working. And once we'd finished the study, what we actually came to realise was that although we had personally assisted the lives of many people, in each of the areas that we were working, in the whole 10 areas, the social statistics in New Zealand had got worse. So we were spending $130 million a year, and we were doing it on, and everything that we were working in was getting worse. So that wasn't good news, actually. So the response to that was to say, well, okay, obviously we can't stop doing what we're doing, but we've got to do more than what we're doing, and we've got to engage with those people who are actually involved in policy and structural issues in New Zealand society. And so we set up a unit called the Social Policy and Parliamentary Unit with the intent of engaging with what we saw as the sort of 350, 400 people who are the significant people in determining what the policy shape of New Zealand is. And that's what we've been doing for the last, I think now, nearly 14, 15 years. And a wee while ago, we had one of the universities in New Zealand do an analysis of what impact the unit had had, and it was very humbling, really, because we part of what was said was they went out to outside agencies, they went to all politicians, they went to political parties, they went to government departments, they went to business. And we got some very interesting feedback. A cabinet minister saying this is most probably the most effective unit in New Zealand in influencing and shaping policy. So I guess where I come to is saying, why was that unit set up? The unit was set up because we felt that there was part of theology, part of faith, which had actually something to contribute in the wider range of what was occurring in New Zealand. And so it's on that basis that I come. The unit itself is a multidiscipline. It has economics, economists as part of the unit. We have social policy people, those experienced in social service delivery, and also has lawyers. And theologians. So it's those mixes, and it's, I guess, that theological component, not to put aside the other disciplines, but also to say that theology component we thought was important. And that's what we've been doing over the last 15 years. We put out yearly a State of the Nation report at the beginning of the year. Before the Prime Minister puts his State of the Nation, we try and come in first. And now it's become a headline in the news and media in the country, people wanting to know where the country's up to in terms of that sort of theological look, if you like, at what's going on. Arguably, I suppose it could be said that the situation of refugees and asylum seekers in the world is is really one of the global issues of our time. And it's a situation which is creating massive numbers of people who are moving across national borders. And we've got as we turn on the radio this morning, even flashed up actually while I was waiting, was a note bringing the latest situation in Myanmar and what's occurring there. The world seems to have learnt in the 20th century the futility of global conflict and of that approach in active state upon state wars. And I suppose that's happened for a number of reasons. I think the nuclear developments and the fact that you can actually wipe out the whole world has perhaps stopped those sorts of approaches. But also there's been other. So we've lived in a relatively calm period since the Second World War in sort of global context, state upon state. What has emerged, however, in its place is a plethora of civil and internal religious, ethnic, political, state conflicts, which we know result in sort of massive cruelty, massive hunger, homelessness, people displacement, acts of terror, genocide, a whole range of things. And the result of these internal conflicts has been to see people moving right across the world. And we've seen, I think, in the last 12 months, some incredibly powerful pictures on our screens and in our media of people just moving, thousands of people moving across their border. According to the United Nations High Commissioner for Refugees, we are now witnessing the highest level of displacement that the world has ever known. We have an unprecedented 65 million people around the world who have been forced from their homes. So that's about 3 times the population of Australia who have been forced from their home. Among them, 22 million refugees. Over half of those people are under the age of 18. So you've got 22 million, half of them under 18. So just imagine that number of people, young people who are moving around the world, who are displaced. Imagine the personal things that happen to people who are moved in that way. And then we wonder why we've got terrorism, why we've got some of the issues that we've got. How easily it must be when you're under that sort of pressure to be impacted by any extremist who comes and seems to offer you some hope or some way out of your situation. And so, the world makes all sorts of responses. One of the responses is to build a big wall between one country and the other. Which to my mind is just likely to deepen the very alienation that those people have. And so we have this massive problem. In fact, while we meet here, every minute nearly 20 people are forcibly displaced from their country. That gives you some idea of the extent of what's going on. During 2016, 10.3 million people were newly displaced, and this included 6.9 million individuals who were displaced within the borders of their own country, and 3.4 million new refugees and new asylum seekers. And the vast majority of those people are living, in fact, in poorer countries. It's developing and poorer countries that are doing the heavy lifting. 84% of refugees are residing in countries which are next to them, which are usually low and middle-income countries. Countries such as Uganda are doing an outstanding job in keeping their borders open. While some of the wealthiest countries, including New Zealand, Australia, are spending a lot of time looking at ways of reducing the likelihood of people moving within our borders. Of the 2.5 million refugees who had status recognised last year and were resettled, just 1.43 were assisted by Australia, and Australia recognised last year 6,500 asylum seekers, and that was 0.28 of the world's asylum seekers. And at the end of 2016, there was 5,090 asylum applications pending in Australia. Last year, 89,000 refugees globally were offered the chance to resettle, and that represents just 1.1% of the 17.2 million refugees who UNHCR are responsible to find a place for. So in other words, at the current rate of progress, we'll resettle those people in 100 years. That's the people who are currently needing. So just to say that, to give you some idea of the extent of what we're talking about. And of course that pressure not only places a pressure on refugee families, it places a pressure on receiving families, and the refugee debate goes on. It often centres on legality and illegality, the documented and undocumented. It talks about citizenship and aliens. And so we've got this huge problem. The scale of the problem means that we're really at the end, and I think that's what Carl was saying in terms of what he said to us earlier. The human services or the humanity disciplines have really come to the end of their ability to deal with such numbers at such scope. And that's really some of the difficulty that we've had, because it's the humanity disciplines which have largely shaped our thinking on refugee and asylum seekers. And the impact of those disciplines has produced some marvellous and some positive results. But in an issue of such scale, these disciplines are woefully inadequate. One of the things that I organise and have for a number of years is the meeting of the church leaders in New Zealand with the Prime Minister, and usually it happens a couple of times a year. And we were in a meeting not so long ago, and the Prime Minister, we'd presented, these church leaders presented 3 papers. They were all pretty well, they'd been very well thought out, they were rigorous, they were evidence-based and all sorts of things. And there was one on homelessness, there was one on superannuation, and there was one on, I can't remember what the other one was on. And we were debating these backwards and forward, the Prime Minister and some of the leading members of Cabinet. And as we came to the end of that time, the Deputy Prime Minister hadn't said anything. And Prime Minister said to the Deputy Prime Minister, well, what do you think, Jim? And he said, you know, I've listened carefully, I've read these papers, I've listened carefully to what's been said. And he said, I think that we could really do something if we took all these policies on board that church leaders are doing. And he said, I think we could really achieve something. He said we could achieve something if we trebled the budgets of what's going on. But he said at the end, he said, what I'm noting is that we would still have a huge problem. And he said, it's something I couldn't put my finger on, but he said it's something about the state of the people that I meet. And he said, I'd put it in terms of sort of faith. And he said, I thought the church leaders might have something to say in that regard. It was a challenging moment. And I guess that's why we are looking at this area of theology, because there is, even amongst our politicians, I find, a desperation to find some way out of some of the crises which they're actually dealing with. And they introduce the best things they can, but I think what he was saying on that morning is that he thought the church leaders had something to offer in the way of theological and spiritual view. Theology, after all, considers the very meaning of human life, its purpose, its source, and therefore it makes sense it would have something to offer in the world's most intractable problems. Theology when it is considered in particularly the area that we're talking about, is often thought about in a pastoral way. How can we help people better? But it really, do we think about it in a wider context of issues of human complexity? And I guess that's what we've been trying to do in the Social Policy Unit over the last 14, 15 years. We've been trying to bring that area and say, what is Christian theology, what is Christian faith, what does the gospel mean in terms of these big issues of homelessness, of poverty, of asylum seeking and all the rest of it. And over the last 50 years, theology itself has become more experienced, more engaged, I suppose, in lived experience in around areas of liberation, the environment, feminism, religious pluralism and sexuality and a number of other things. So the global movement of displaced and refugee people provides an incredible opportunity for Christian faith and theology. So I want to look briefly then at this whole area of theology. A theology of hope and healing for refugee and asylum seekers. And I'm assisted in my thinking by a very wonderful Catholic theologian, Daniel Grudy. And he talks about four areas. He talks about four areas of theology: the image of God, the incarnation, civil and divine law, and the community. And I'd just like to quickly talk about that. When we talk about people displaced by events beyond their control, we use terms like refugee, asylum seeker, migrant, undocumented person, many other terms. The very problem with those labels is they label people by their political stance, their economic stance, or their social stance, rather than their human identity. And you see, that's something we commonly do, isn't it? We talk about homeless, we talk about street people, we talk about family that's overcrowded, to describe people with no shelter. We talk about beneficiaries, dole budgers, living on the state. They're terms to describe people dependent on the state for income, or unemployed, work shy, bludger, job seeker, people without work. So we immediately always want to leap to political, social, or economic terms to describe people. And I guess that's where theology, firstly, has something very strongly to say. And I like this statement by Pope Francis. We must regain the conviction that we need one another, that we have a shared responsibility for others and the world, and that being good and decent are worth it. It puts a different context on the sort of economic, social and political stance. In the very first book of the Bible, we're introduced to a term which is the first of terms that Grudy comes up with, where it says when the creation story talks about all people being created in the image and likeness of God. When I started out on sort of Salvation Army ministry, I was in our Salvation Army training college, and one morning I was, we used to clean up the college and polish it up on a Saturday morning, and I was outside mowing the lawns, and somebody came and interrupted me, and it was a guy who was driving an ambulance. And he said, would you come and help me? And so I went over to what were three houses behind the college, and I knew what was in those houses. They were owned by a well-to-do Wellington landlord who rented them to alcoholics. And essentially they went down every day. He would give them some money and he would take the rent out of their benefit, and he was getting an enormous amount of money for each of the houses, and basically killing them by giving them a bit of money each day, and just enough to sort of, so they had enough alcohol for the day. And on this particular morning we went into the house and went into the lounge, and in a corner of the lounge there was what was really a yellowing bundle of bones, but somebody who was still alive. And we put him onto the stretcher, and we were carrying him down the stairs, and he died, and I was looking at him as he died. And it was at that moment that I became aware of God saying to me, he was somebody in whom my identity was. He was someone I loved him. But he was sinned against. He wasn't a sinner, he was sinned against. The very situations he was in were a result of human sin and of a covering over of the image of God. You see, people in any situation, I don't think, can be understood apart from a understanding which is that they have an image of God. That's not to dismiss all the wonderful insights of the humanity disciplines, but from a Christian point of view and from the viewpoint of other faiths, we add to this understanding as seeing them in God's image. What does this mean then in the context of refugees? Look at this statement from one of the papal encyclicals on economic justice. When it talks about the things that are needed for life, food, clothing, shelter, the right to choose a state of life freely and to found a family, the right to education, to employment, to a good reputation. But look at the last part of the statement. Preferably, people can meet such needs in their homeland. But when these conditions are not met, people have a right to immigrate in order to more fittingly provide a future for themselves and their families. They have a right to move when they can't recognise those things which make them children of God. The image of God means they have a right to do what it is that will protect the image that is part of what God is in them. They have a right to do that. The image of God in Christian terms, you see, is we talk about a trinity, and so we're talking not about an individual idea there, we're talking about a community idea. It's an idea of people created in the image of God in community. And most refugees leave on their journey not usually for their own benefit, but to also benefit their family, to benefit that community which they're part. There's an interesting statistic from 2006, it's a bit ancient now, but in 2006, migrants sent home to their families, often in small amounts of $100 to $300, more than $300 billion around the world. In that same year, the total overseas development aid from donor nations to poorer countries was $106 billion. And so that means that migrants living on meagre means spent 3 times as much money helping alleviate global poverty than the richest countries in the world. Which is an amazing statistic, isn't it? So Christian theology says when we look into the face of new arrivals, when we look into the face of new arrivals, when we look into the face of refugees or migrants, we are looking into the face of God. That's what theology says. Grudy's second area is the incarnation, and it is important but even more challenging. The incarnation is best described as God through Jesus coming to earth and living a human existence in human community. Karl Barth, who was a German theologian of note, spoke about the incarnation in a fascinating way. If we can just put that up. He talked about the way of the incarnation as the way of the Son of God moving into a foreign country. He states that through it, God enters into the most remote and abandoned places of the human condition. So this, which is so important in the faith connection of God, the idea of God moving from heaven to earth, moving into a foreign country. What Jesus did in his incarnation was to move from heaven to earth for the sake of others. He moved to the place of greatest human need, not because God sees something good about poverty and displacement, but because it is history's darkest places that God can reveal hope to all who experience pain, rejection and alienation. God moves to the most desperate of places. And so incarnation in Christianity means we are required as people to move to the places where people are in pain or rejected or are alienated. And that surely is the place that many refugee and asylum seeker people find themselves in. We see also in the incarnation Jesus actually himself enduring some of the same political and human controversies that face refugees today. In Luke's Gospel, the family of Jesus face a long need to make a journey to get documentation. They had to go to get documentation to a place where they'd been born for a census. In Matthew, Jesus and his family needed to respond to a threat from Herod, the political leader, that was endangering their lives, and they became refugees in Egypt. And then in John's Gospel, people have trouble believing in Jesus because he didn't come from this place. He came from somewhere else. He's an immigrant. And what an echo today we find when our communities and leaders manage to find many compelling political, social, legal and religious reasons to exclude and to reject that whole area. One of the marks also of the life of Jesus was in his time in human community. He associated and lived with a wide range of people. He read from highly influential political leaders and religious leaders to people with terminal diseases and mental illness, people of different nationalities and cultures, rich and poor people, carpenters and fishermen, and then military leaders and academics. Jesus immersed himself without fear or prejudice in terms of his incarnation. And people today often want to limit the number of refugees or new arrivals out of fear, prejudice, or what they see as a protection of the national way of life. What we see in the incarnation of Jesus is something in contrast to that. We see someone who totally identifies with people, whoever they are, allows people to make their own way, but who never loses who he is or the mission and purpose of his life. He didn't feel the need to change the people. He felt the need to be who he was and to listen to them and be with them. When we live with people, something happens. They look at us and their life changes. I was sitting recently in airport and I was doing some work on my computer, and I finished my computer and put down the lid, and at the same time the guy in the sitting next to me did the same thing. And we looked at each other and he said, "Oh, you're Campbell Roberts." I looked at him and I thought, "I don't know who you are." And I said, "Yes." He said, "You've had a great influence on my life and family." And I looked at him again and I thought, "I don't even know who you are." And he said, "You won't remember me," but he said 25 years ago, he said, "You were a chaplain in the factory where I was." And he said, "You impacted that factory and you impacted me." And he said, "I went home to my family and said, this guy often is on the media. Every time he's on the media, we need to think about what he says. And we need to get together as a family and reflect about whether it has anything to do with us and our family and our way of living." And he said, "We've been doing that." And he said, "Every time you're on the media," he said, we reflect. And he said, "You've had a huge impact on the way that we live." Well, it could have knocked me over. But I think what I'm trying to say is that's how it happens. It's not about, there is influence when we actually live in a particular way, and it influences the lives of others. Another thing that the incarnation does, though, and did, is that it offends some people. It offended the religious leaders. Jesus coming and saying he was the Son of God was a big offence to religion and to the status quo. I, on another occasion, had made a big media statement about an aspect of welfare in New Zealand, and I got back into my office and the phone rang, and it was the Minister of Social Welfare. And she said to me, "I'm very offended by what you've said on the radio today." And I said, "Oh, I'm very sorry that you're offended, but the reason I said it was this." So we spoke for the next 2 hours in terms of trying to articulate that. I think when we articulate sometimes what it is that we are about and where we're coming from and our belief structure into the situations, then we will offend people. And if individual Christians in the Salvation Army act over refugees and asylum seekers, sometimes it may offend deeply held Aussie values, or it may offend some significant people in the community. And that's not enough reason, actually, to stop doing those things. We've obviously got to do it with grace and with, okay. But it's not enough reason to stop doing. Okay, we've got 5 minutes, so I need to rush on here. The incarnation is also another thing. It's a border crossing event. It's a model, Grudy says, it's a model of gratuitous self-giving through which God empties himself of everything but love so that he can more formally identify. And look at that statement. So it is that movement of saying we need to fully identify, we need to be with vulnerable communities. But the incarnation, I think, requires an even more radical response. Look at this from the philosopher Isaiah, who says this, and it's a very powerful statement. He says, to tear down the walls and let them all in, this is the easy demand of soft-hearted liberal radicals. But to tear down the true wall, not the immigration department, but the socio-economic one, to change society so that people will no longer desperately try to escape their own world. And see, that's the challenge, isn't it? We can do all of these things to help people come into a community, but the reality is that we need to change something about ourselves and our own society. People commonly say they have no problem with immigration or refugees, but they do have a problem. It's a challenge to alter how we organisationally and individually live, how we consume and how we trade, and how we conduct our lives. It leads to a fundamental questioning of the life we live. And so going with Jesus across the border into a completely unknown space where we become completely vulnerable to others. Another term that he talks about is the law, not in human terms, but in God's term. And you see, no area causes more division in the refugee and asylum seeker debate than the issue of the law. And people commonly say they have no problem with immigration or refugees, but they do have a problem with people breaking the law. The problem with this perspective, you see, when you look at it in theological terms, is that it makes no distinction between the various kinds of law and assumes equal binding force on all law. In theology, it's possible to identify a difference between divine law and civil law. Jesus recognised the value of law, but he also challenged people to see the larger pictures of the law. And there are many instances in the Gospels where Jesus was challenged about eating grain, picking grain on the Sabbath and healing a man on the Sabbath. And he talks about a higher law. And I think it's a really important aspect. You see, today, thousands of migrants and refugees die each year trying to cross borders and get safely to Europe, to South Pacific, to Africa, to the Middle East, to the United States. And there's all types of laws in action. National laws that control borders, laws of human nature has caused people to seek a more dignified and happy life for themselves and their family. Natural law that presents ethical dimensions of how we respond to people in need. And divine law that expresses God's will for people. And the fact that people are dying in their attempt to meet basic human need raises a very serious question about how civil and national laws are currently dealing with the situation. Injustice occurs when we see refugees as problems in themselves rather than symptoms of deep social ills, inequality and political tyranny. When we see the refugee issue as one of national security rather than as a chance to respond to human insecurity. and when we treat new arrivals as foreigners rather than neighbours. And then the last point, and I won't go into it, but there will be a paper that you can look at. The last point is one of a new understanding of community. And Jesus shared food and drink with people that were often categorised by others as evil or sinful. But he went to all of those people, and it's so important. You see, Trump recently defined community in the United States as allegiance to the flag and citizenship. And he rejected the players who see their prime responsibility as ones to speak out on matters of social injustice. You see, Christian theology doesn't actually support the Trump view. Rather, it says one's ultimate responsibility is to God alone, and that leads people past national and political borders. Okay, just then stripping through half of my notes here, but what does that leave us with? I think it leaves us with some things that I'd like you to go on thinking about over this day. It seems to suggest that those theological principles seem to suggest working alongside people arriving into community will not only incorporate the best practices of humanitarian disciplines, but whether it's pastoral care, advocacy, or working for better public policy, we will carry an overwhelming sense of extreme value of the people we work with, people made in the image and likeness of God. It seems to suggest the image of God is Trinitarian, the idea of people living in close and real connection with others, and our work, therefore, will hold family, tribal and cultural connections as vital and integral parts of how we preserve a person's integrity and wholeness. It seems we must be prepared to offend those who continue law, policies or practices that will isolate or marginalise migrants and refugees. It seems we must keep under review our own practices and lifestyle, so as the only way in the end to assist people so they don't have to leave their countries, and we conduct the world in a different way. It seems we should use our influence towards the framing of laws and policies which truly meet human aspiration. It seems that we need to mark a culture of hospitality that creates a place for everyone. And we will encourage communities in which we are part to not see refugees as problems, but as a threat to our security or well-being, but as an opportunity instead to enrich our own understanding and extend our borders. When we meet people robbed of their material possessions, human dignity and personhood, then our mission is to look into their eyes, to see their faces and stand alongside them and ensure they are surrounded and enveloped by a community that restores their humanity and gives them work and income to thrive. We need to look into the eyes of people imprisoned, marginalised and isolated, and let them experience justice, love, freedom and acceptance. We're going to go to morning tea, but I'd just like us to play that last video just as you're going, because this is a very powerful... people were put together and told not to speak to each other for 4 minutes, and just look into the other person's face. Just look at some of the at the impact as you go to morning tea. Thank you.
Have a nice mustache. 6, 5. Wie? 6, 5.
Are you new in Berlin?
Yeah, 8 months.
And are you alone here or with your family?
Why don't this life sometime nice, sometime not good.
Beatrice. Oh my god, I'm keeping my eyes on you. Wow. Hello. I expect you to ask my number. Be a strong man.
Thank you so much. We will go to the zoo, maybe next few days. Text you if you would like to.
I would love it. Of course. You can do it.
When I was looking into her eyes, I was trying to see what I could tell from the life that she lived, and I think I could tell that there was a lot of experience lived there.
It doesn't matter, look in the eyes or something, just give yourself a chance to talk and to look at the other person.